Hoki mai anō, welcome back. I'm delighted now to welcome the Commerce Commission Chair, Dr. John Small, to the stage. John addressed this conference 2 years ago to introduce the Commerce Commission as the retail payment system regulator. I was just joking with him before, he might have ruffled a few feathers. It's great to see him back though. And he's here with us again this time to discuss how the payment system can better meet the evolving needs of New Zealanders. You'll have the opportunity to ask questions of John after his presentation of this session. Remember, go to the Q&A in the app or put your hand up and we'll throw a mic at you, literally. Please put your hands together for John Small.
Kia ora katoa. Very nice to be here again at this fantastic conference. Ngā mihi to Ngāti Whātua, Ōrāki, Mana Whenua. Ngā mihi to Te Whana Ao for that fantastic mihi whakatau that kicked us off this morning, which I personally found really innovating and exciting. And also ngā mihi te mātua Rāreti Mahika, who, for that Matarangi Māori session, which are, again, inspiring and a great kind of way to introduce this conference, which is about where we've come from and where we're going to, navigating towards the future. So what I'm going to do just in the next 10 minutes is, or probably 9 minutes now, is go over a few things. First one is about kind of what is the big picture, what is this future that we're heading towards, try and give you some idea of how we see that. And secondly, I want to talk about the fact that this is really a team effort, that you guys and women and people that are here can't do this on your own. We certainly couldn't do it on our own. We're hopeless. Not hopeless, but we've got a different job. But it's a team effort is my point. And we need to work together. And so with that in mind, then I'll kind of talk a little bit about how we see the sort of roles and responsibilities, and then kind of close with a few final comments. So that's the rough plan. Let's get into it. So what's the vision? What are we heading for? We all know that payments are actually almost literally the lifeblood of our economy. By far the most used financial service that there is, crucial to the way we live our lives, crucial to the thriving of business, and if you're looking ahead to things like open banking, also crucial to that. I mean, if you look at we see open payments as crucial to open banking, and we see situations where that payments have come after sort of account information open banking, and it hasn't been so great. So, and this connects into one of the previous speakers who was talking about how payments have really accelerated particular business models as well. So that's the first point, lifeblood of our economy. Obviously, it's very clear technology is just rapidly expanding all of our choices and potential options. And the thing is, from an economic point of view and from a competition point of view, what's really important to us at the Commission is that these new options all get a fair shot at success. And that means access into markets and customers on fair terms. So that's really important to us. And so therefore, I think, summarising all this, our vision for payments, and I think this is broadly shared at least across the public sector, and I think I'd invite you to buy into it as well, is that what we're after is reliable and efficient payments that better meet the evolving needs of all New Zealanders. I emphasise better in there and evolving because I think this is a process, it's not an end state. This is we need to configure ourselves in such a way that we can enable the use cases that we see in front of us now, and we're okay also to enable future ones as they evolve and gain traction. So that is where I think we're going. Yeah, so it is a team effort though. And, you know, there's out here in this room, there's an incredible mix of commercial, technical talent of all sorts, entrepreneurs, investors, technologists, business execs, marketers, and a few of us civil servants hanging around. But, you know, I think in this day and age, November 2024, we have to now accept that as talented and clever as you all are, you can't do it alone. I think there's been fantastic progress in this sector over the last year and the last couple of years. I certainly agree with Steve that we're kind of poised for greatness here. But, you know, in a sense, government/regulatory failure has been one of the things that's holding us back. And so, you know, it's not enough for the government to just demand that you folk just sort it out. You know, we already tried that. It didn't really work, you know, so that's why I think this is a team game and that we all need to work together. There are two really main barriers, I think, that regulators can help deal with and facilitate the progress that you folk are going to make. And that is in the area of, the barriers really are about misaligned incentives as between incumbents and entrants. So incumbents naturally want to give some business to protect. Entrants, to some extent, not always, but to some extent, attacking that and trying to eat their lunch. So there's that market access point coming in there that's really important. And then I think the second area is that there are some regulatory barriers to efficient cooperation. It's not that easy it's kind of illegal actually in some ways for competitors to get into a room and talk about certain things. And that was a question that was put to me from the floor last time I was here 2 years ago from Russell Bryant. They said, hey, we can't do this stuff because you guys will be on our back, you know, suing us under the Commerce Act. And so we said, come on, let's talk about this. That can't be a barrier. We have to get rid of that. And I think we have. We've made good progress on that. So both of these barriers are kind of in or close to the Commission's wheelhouse, and we're trying to work on both of them. So I'm happy to talk more about that a bit later. But let me crack on. So about, excuse me. Talking now about roles and responsibilities, who does what to make this waka go faster. I think broadly speaking, you know, there's about three groups of people here. There's incumbents, people who work for banks and large, well-established firms. There's the entrants, people who are burning cash, looking for a market, looking for an entry and hoping to get there before the cash runs out. And there's people like us, regulators, that are trying to facilitate this to make it work. And we really do need to work collaboratively, I think. And part of that is holding each other to account. You know, we need to be able to, I think, hold you to account, or some of you to account in some ways, but it's on us as well. You know, we accept that we operate in an authorising environment that's highly variable. You can criticise us, you can sue us, you can complain to our minister about us. He'll be here tomorrow. But anyway, I think, you know, we do need to work together, hold each other to account, heading in the same direction. Our job, I think, is partly about providing strategic leadership and sort of setting expectations and trying to keep things moving. Partly about removing barriers to progress. And in that category, I'd include, you know, the risk of sort of regulatory gaps and overlaps. We had Manisha's slide that showed 4 regulators. You know, it's on us to make sure that side of things works seamlessly and doesn't create big holes for you folk. And then also to align incentives properly with the vision. And then obviously your jobs are to get out there and compete hard, innovate, invest efficiently, respond to your customers, serve them well, and thrive and prosper. So if we get all this right, what does it look like? I think from the end user perspective, payments will be easier to manage, they'll be cheaper, they'll be faster, they'll be safer. And all of the promises I've been making to people for the last couple of years will come true, so that'll be good, that'll help me. Meanwhile, out the back, where nobody sees it, all of these components to make this beautiful system run will be operating smoothly and efficiently. Open banking will be fully operational. Digital identities will be ubiquitous. Gosh, inshallah. And the new shared infrastructure will be in place, and it'll all work. And I'm at the end of my time, so that's it. 5 minutes of questions. If anyone's got questions, fire them.
Just check and see if we've got some coming up. I'm going to stand in the middle there, John.
Yeah, sure.
We're going to hawk you out here, pimp you out into the middle of the stage. Has anyone got any questions? We can throw the mic, or we could pass the mic over. I'll just see if we've got a question in our... yes, let's just wait till we get the mic. Thank you.
Julia.
Hi, it's Julia here from Worldline. Hi, John.
Hi.
I've just got a question that related to your removing barriers point. I guess it's been a little while now since that proposal to recommend designation of the Interbank Network went to the Minister. I was just wondering if you had any update related to that.
No, short answer is no. Sorry, Julia, I don't. But the Minister will be here tomorrow, and perhaps you could ask him and express upon him, how important it is.
Do we have another question out there? I think the last time, 2 years ago when you were speaking about this, we were talking about speed.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts around speed at the moment?
Look, I feel like we have come a long way. There's been some fantastic developments, but I think we're all painfully, it's natural for us to want to get a bit further along, and there's still some big challenges ahead of us. But I'm actually quite confident about where we're going and the speed with which we can get there. I will emphasise again that it's not a race to the finish line, though. It's a race to kind of the start line to get to a point from which we can then further evolve. If you think about the use cases that are being enabled through API standards, for example, they need to evolve over time. So, that's what we're heading for now is the first part of that, and we need to think quite carefully about what's an efficient process for moving that forward.
We were speaking earlier, and I was telling John about my son, who's 24. He works for a New Zealand founded startup, but he's now based in London. They work through open banking, and he said, I told him when I was doing this, he said, well, tell them to get a bloody move on, would you? Because I want to come home. We've got a question through the app here. Why do you think New Zealand has fallen behind in the last decades? What can we do to bring about more competition?
Yeah, that's a good one. Look, as we know, we were all very proud. 20 years ago, we were all crowing about this wonderful EFTPOS system that we had and how much money it saved and how easy it was, and maybe a little bit more than that. I don't know. Time goes different when you get older. I think actually that kind of may have lulled us into a false sense of security. That we had this fairly ubiquitous payment technology that was just about free, and that was part of the problem. There was no money in it, and so the banks didn't find it advantageous to reinvest in it. And so a combination of that, and I also think, to be blunt, a bit of regulatory failure there, a bit of government and officials not realising that this is not something that could be done alone, And so I think, a bit more conversation between business and government would have been perhaps helpful. Those would be my thoughts.
We had one other. We'll take this last question here. Thank you.
John, can you give us some indication of the liaison you have with the Australian regulatory bodies? I think over time there are many organisations here that are sort of pan-ANZ, and it's hard to get a handle on things when they're different.
Yeah.
But then we probably want to be different when they do what we don't want them to.
Yeah, that's right. Cooperation and alignment's potentially a two-edged sword. What I can say is that our payments team, and there's several of them here in this room, and I encourage you to chat with them. They are very closely linked with their counterparts in Australia and in Britain and in Canada. And so to the point where they have kind of every couple of weeks they get on the phone together, talk to each other about what's going on. So I think we are, the Commission is at least very plugged into payments regulation internationally, and we're learning from each other, and there's a degree of kind of leapfrogging of each other. But there's still some big challenges, of course, even as between New Zealand and Australia. And you'd think that would be one that we could, get working properly first.
Liana Kiakwe, thank you, John, for your presentation. John Small, give him a big round of applause, please. And thank you for your questions. We've run out of time for Q&A, but John's going to be part of our next panel. Now that we've heard from John, please welcome Ian Woolford, Director of Money in Cash at the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, Te Pūtea Mātua, and Catherine Beard, Director of Advocacy at Business NZ, who will join John for a fireside chat. And the discussion will be moderated by Emma Geard, Senior Associate at Buddle Finlay. I'd also like to acknowledge Buddle Finlay as their generous sponsorship of this session. Give them all a big round of applause, please.
Tēnā tātou katoa, welcome everyone, welcome panellists, it's great to have you here. And I'm Emma Geard from Buddle Finlay, today's session sponsor, and I'm very excited to be part of this discussion, which is a real crucial part of the conversation that is the theme of this conference, Ki Tua, Navigating Beyond. And we've heard today already about how regulation plays, it can be a key lever to creating change. And we've also heard that it can create confusion, uncertainty, and can create barriers. So what we really want to have today is a discussion about regulation versus self-determination, how we strike the balance to help New Zealand navigate beyond the status quo and towards the payment system of the future, the world-class evolving payment system for Aotearoa New Zealand. So we've got an excellent group of panellists here. We've already been introduced to John Small. I should say Dr. John Small. From the Commerce Commission. We've got Ian Woolford from the Reserve Bank. He is a Reserve Bank veteran who has worked in almost every area of the Reserve Bank and is currently the Director of Money in Cash. And he brings the perspective of both a regulator and a participant in the payment system. And we also have Catherine Beard, who comes from, she is the Director of Advocacy at Business New Zealand, the largest business advocacy body, and she is bringing the perspective of regulated entities. So with that, let's crack into the conversation. And my first question is, what do you panellists and the entities you work for, what do you want to see from the New Zealand payment system? And what are the barriers you see to realising that? Now, I know, John, you've already answered that question slightly, but because you're warmed up, do you want to summarise your speech?
Sure. Look, I might just put a slightly different angle on it, which is, I mentioned a couple of times, this concept of perhaps regulatory failure, and that sort of plays into that language of market failure versus regulatory failure. There's another way to think about those concepts, which is about coordination and how do we coordinate economic activity, and is it who's got the rights to do that and who's got the obligations to do that? And so, to me, it feels like that this is, as I said before, this is not something we can do alone, either business people or obviously not regulators. We need to work together in a coordinated way with this kind of common view of where things need to head. And our job is to remove barriers, I think, essentially, and provide a bit of direction and leadership. But none of this works unless there's a really good two-way conversation.
Great. Ian, do you want to add anything to the question?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I agree with John's point about having to work together, but let me for a moment play the bad cop to John's good cop, I guess. So it was very interesting listening to Manish this morning. You know, he was talking about Singapore, right? So you've got a hawker, you've got peer-to-peer instant payments, possibly even offline, right? And when you go to an international conference, what you often do is you try and find something nice to say about the country that you're in. And he mentioned EFTPOS. Well, actually, it was about 45 years ago that EFTPOS, we were world leading. And, you know, the analogy we often say is we were sort of the All Blacks of the payment world back then when EFTPOS came in. And I was trying to think about what's the right calibration for where we are now. My sort of posit to you is we're sort of runner-up in maybe an inter-club regional rugby contest. Now, you might disagree with the miscalibration. I mean, you know, we've fielded a team, the payment system works, but we are so far behind. And whether you ascribe that to regulatory failure or the incentives in the system, however you do it, we've got a lot of work to do. We don't have a faster payment system. We don't have all the sort of functionality you see when you go overseas. So it's not to try and rain on the parade. It's really important, these sorts of events. We get together and we talk. But I think all of that discussion that we've had this morning about the future, that's great. You know, we all want to see better outcomes, but I think we need to be realistic about the starting point. And I think, you know, this idea that you've got regulation versus self-determination, you know, I mean, from my position, I think, you know, you need to have a really good look at how well self-determination is working. We need leadership, and you need some direction. You know, when you look at what's driven good outcomes in a lot of payment systems around the world, not all, but a lot of payment systems, it has been regulatory leadership, and that has been missing. I think that's fair to say. Yeah.
Catherine, do you have anything to add about New Zealand business more generally and some of the challenges that we face here?
Yeah, sure. Look, competition is vital. You know, New Zealand has got a productivity problem, and I'm sure you're all aware of it. We've been not growing as fast as we should have, and we're actually falling behind other countries. So we have to have a really hard look at how we get our economy cranking. How do we enhance productivity? And part of that is, you know, coming down to competition and innovation. So I think we've really got to embrace it. It's really challenging in New Zealand because we have such a small market, and it's not just a banking and payments industry issue, it's right across a whole lot of sectors in New Zealand. I was just reading that OECD have put out a report called Revamping Competition in New Zealand, and, you know, they have a look at a whole lot of different sectors. Be no surprise to you, you'd be reading about it in the newspaper all the time. And actually it makes New Zealand quite an expensive place to live. Whether that's the cost of putting horizontal infrastructure in, whether it's the cost of housing, you know, how can we keep young people here and have them live here and see their future here if they think they can never afford a house? The cost of food, the building sector, fuel. So it's really, as I see it, a challenge of a teeny tiny market. There's 5 million people here, and we're not a small country. We're actually a big country with a small population, you know, the size of a Sydney or something. So actually our regulatory settings have to be best in the world so that we can have that innovation and that competition and start to punch above our weight, because that's the only way we're going to have higher incomes and all of these things that we want for a great New Zealand into the future.
Thanks, Catherine. Yeah, and John, you talked about access earlier, and access being key to getting more competition and innovation. I think the other key elements of governance in the payments environment are things like protecting efficiency and safety, and that comes from governance of very technical, interoperable systems, very detailed rules of engagement. So there's clearly still a place for industry to be very involved in government. Can you, governance, sorry. Can you talk a little bit about the regulatory interventions that you think will add the most value and support industry governance?
Yes. So yeah, you're right that the technical working groups that use that develop standards and certainly once those standards are promulgated through firms, that's the domain of technologists, rightly so. They're the ones who know how to make things happen and what's feasible and what's not and what it's going to cost. The trick is really, I think, to arrange, and this is where I think we have a role and other agencies have a role, is to try and arrange governance systems such that those are likely to give good outcomes. So, one of the areas where we faced this year was in the authorisation that Steve referred to, which was a request from Payments New Zealand to be allowed to coordinate on matters that are absolutely crucial to getting open banking and open payments running, being things like the accreditation regimes and such like. And so one of the things when we looked at that, we thought, well, okay, they weren't asking us. So authorisation, for those who don't know, is a situation where there's conceivably a substantial lessening of competition from what people are wanting to do, but there's an offsetting benefit, which means that it should be authorised. And so we have the ability to do that, and they asked us to do this because they were wanting to get into a room together and talk about this stuff, which kind of looked a little anti-competitive. We said, yeah, look, we can, but they didn't come to us and say, and this is what we want to agree on. So we didn't have a final deal to assess. Mm-hmm. You know about this. And so we couldn't say, oh, this is what they want to do. They were asking us to authorise a process by which they get there. And that, from our point of view, required really careful thought about who's running this process, where's the independent direction, where's the contestability between incumbents and entrants, how can we be confident that this governance structure is going to lead to a good outcome? Mm-hmm. And so that's the kind of, and it's quite subtle, because in the end we've said, yeah, go and do it under these conditions, and good luck to you, and I hope it works, But it's just a matter of, it's quite subtle. You've got to be comfortable that this arrangement is going to give reasonable outcomes.
Right, and Ian, you think we need a little bit more regulatory involvement? What do you think that looks like?
Well, I think it's probably going to be a bit multi-dimensional. I think if you step back a little bit and picking up on John's point, the Reserve Bank opposed the arrangements around open banking, and for one simple reason, and that was around the governance of Payments NZ. When you look at Payments NZ, their aspirations are fully aligned with the Reserve Bank, with the Commerce Commission, I would say with the other regulators. Better outcomes for New Zealanders. That's what we want to see. In our view, there's a governance problem with the incumbents. There's a lack of investment, and the incumbents have problems, right? They've got legacy systems. There's a lot of costs. But to John's point, there's potential competition out there that's getting stifled. So you can have direct regulatory intervention, you can have more control, and you can try and change the incentives. And I think that's kind of where we're coming from. That you probably need a a toolbox that has all of those dimensions, where we want to try and change the incentives just through what we can do at the Reserve Bank. Competition and innovation and efficiency is a big driver for our work on digital payments, central bank digital currency. So we're quite explicit that that can be outside of the banking system, because we want to encourage competition and better outcomes and lower costs. You know, sorry, I'm going on a bit of a rant here, but a senior member of the banking industry said to me a while ago in a meeting that the New Zealand payment system was innovative. We have the highest penetration of card schemes here in the world. And to me, that is a symbol of failure, not success. You know, we need an environment where you've got healthy competition and you've got a diversity of product offerings and on a more efficient sort of grounds. Now, all of this comes, to Catherine's point, at sort of a cost to productivity. You know, payments make up a huge amount of value for industry, and you can see why people don't want to rock the boat too much. But I think we'll all be better off, including the incumbents, with a more diverse set of product innovation and more certain. So I think there is a role for regulators, and I think there are gaps in the regulatory toolbox. So yeah, watch the space, I think.
I'm going to play devil's advocate now.
Sure.
And I think, you know, we've also heard today that payments, it's not just an activity, it is a network. It's a complex web of industry participants working together, and it's not easy to move that forward as a system. And of course, that is where regulators will have a role, but you'll need industry to participate in that as well. And I think it sounds like industry regulators, they all want to get to the same place, but the how to get there is a real challenge. And so, Catherine, do you want to talk a little bit about, you know, perhaps areas where regulation may have slowed progress down and the pitfalls that we need to look out for?
Sure. Yeah, look, I think it's really important that, you know, regulation is informed by the subject matter experts. So I think, you know, the bureaucrats and the policymakers who are putting together groups to figure this stuff out need to actually be hearing from the industry concerned. I think you don't just obviously talk to the industry, you talk to the potential users of the system, so you make sure that you have them in the mix. But I think we've seen lots of examples, particularly from my perspective and my observation under the previous government. I think it's changing a bit now, where industry weren't really consulted and they weren't listened to. And if you do that, you get really dumb outcomes. And one of the examples is the Credit Contracts and Consumer Finance Act. You know, the goal there, if I understand it right, was to clamp down on loan shark behaviour. But the regulations that were brought in for the banks in terms of being across all that stuff was so onerous that, you know, it just about ground the system to a halt. And you had the banks clamp down on lending, you had them looking at whether people were having too much McDonald's, etc., etc. Now, the crazy thing about that was the industry was consulted. They did write submissions, and there were probably a few industry groups involved, and said, look, if you do this, this will happen, so don't do it this way. And 2 years went by of select committee hearings and submission writing, and they just didn't listen, and they did it anyway. And then the unintended consequence happened, which everyone in the industry said would happen. So, you know, there's also a productivity drag on New Zealand. Imagine how much time and energy is burnt getting a poorly crafted bit of regulation in that then has to be reversed, and all the drama that it caused for lending and consumers. So you've absolutely got to have the subject matter experts in the room, but I would add to that the potential users and beneficiaries of a more competitive environment.
Thanks, Catherine. Yes, and so Payments New Zealand transacts $7 trillion a year through its clearing systems. It does it rather invisibly. It's doing a great job in terms of efficiency and safety. And I know a lot of people in this room, safety is going to be a huge concern. And, you know, we're looking at opening up access. So how, and I'll start with you again, John, how do you think you can approach designing this regulation in partnership with the industry to make sure we're avoiding those unintended consequences?
Look, I think one advantage of the situation that Ian painted of New Zealand is that we've got plenty of places to learn from. And so, you know, and that's one of the things we're trying to do when we did our recently concluded banking study, which leaned heavily on open banking and open payments as a facilitator for open banking. We were very conscious of what's happened in that space internationally, and tried to learn from those experiences. You know, so that's one safety valve, and we'll hear, I think, tomorrow from Scott Farrell about mistakes that Australia have made, and so, which is a nice thing to have an Australian to come and talk about. And so, you know, some of that is about, you know, that's about avoiding the foreseeable pitfalls. But I think to Catherine's point, you know, having the right mix of voices involved is really important, and I like your focus on end users, and I'd say here in this kind of context, end users are part of it, but so are access seekers, you know, fintechs who want in, and so are established financial institutions. So so there's a couple of safeguards there, but ultimately decisions have to be taken, and the best thing we can do is to be well informed about them.
Right, and Catherine, do you have any insights in terms of, from industry perspective, engaging with regulators, what works well and what do we want to see as part of this process in New Zealand?
It kind of goes to my previous comment that you've got to have the right stakeholders involved, and actually my definition of end users includes the fintechs and, you know, the disruptors potentially. Yep. And so, you know, one process I've been involved in lots of these things over the years with different industries and sectors, but one that kind of comes to mind was I was representing the export sector, and Customs were redoing their legislation, and it was quite a big job because it was quite old legislation, and so they put together a pretty comprehensive plan of consultation, got all the stakeholders that they felt were going to be affected or would, you know, be impacted to be in this sort of working group. It took too long from my perspective. Like, I don't know, we were sort of meeting on and off for a couple of years, but by the time they actually had the draft legislation, it was so well, I guess, canvassed amongst all the stakeholders that we pretty much didn't even bother putting a submission in when it, you know, when it turned into a bill, because, you know, it worked because they'd sort of talked to everybody who was going to be affected by it, and you know, we'd worked out a good solution. So I think you just got to work with the sector, but equally make sure that all those interests around the table are there that need to be there.
Right, and we've also heard that there will be a lot of regulators involved in New Zealand, each with potentially different mandates, different goals in terms of regulating payment systems, and we haven't talked much yet about the financial stability mandate. It's slightly less topical right now. But how do you see different regulators working together to make sure we're finding that path of least resistance?
Yeah, well, I mean, I agree with both Catherine and John in terms of everyone, the right people being at the table. We work very closely with Commerce, and have spent a lot of time when Commerce got their new payments powers working with them. Coordination is a key thing. I think sort of clarity. To me, I think the COFA, Council of Financial Regulators, getting a payments vision is actually a really positive thing because it's driving, or should be driving, a more coordinated response at the most senior levels within the regulators. Now, DIA is not a member of the Council of Financial Regulators, but others are, and so that's really good. I think this. I'm going to stray again, sorry, but I think this idea of regulation getting in the way and concern around things going wrong is true. You can point to examples where things have gone wrong, but I do want to come back to the self-determination point again. I mean, Steve gave a great speech this morning. It was very encouraging and positive and uplifting, and one of the things he mentioned was SBI 365. Well, I was involved in the early days of encouraging industry to get that going, and that was 15 years ago. So I think we just need to be a little bit realistic about the self-determination and regulation getting in the way of things. Sometimes it helps to have, to speak softly and carry a big stick. Sometimes it helps to have regulatory backing to help, focus the mind and drive things on. Now, you absolutely need to work with people and be coordinated across regulators and give as much clarity as possible so you don't get bounced around from one regulator to another. Mm-hmm. There is a real coordination, roadmap clarity thing, and I think there's still some work for regulators to do there, but it's a fair point.
Mm. Yeah, and I think that as we near the end of our time, that brings us back to the theme of the session, which is striking the balance. And I think there may be some issues with industry self-determination and misaligned incentives potentially leading to slower than desired outcomes. And then on the other hand, there are some pitfalls of regulation. Do you have any final comments or aspirational thoughts that you'd like to share with the group on how we find the right balance and the path of least resistance to where we want to get to? Open to the floor.
I would say we're so far behind that the opportunity to leapfrog is staring us in the face. That would be my comment.
Can I just, before I answer that, can I just go back to the previous one about multiple regulators? Because I think this is quite a normal thing. Mm-hmm. What's happened here is technology and preferences have thrown up a new problem, and the government sector has not been prepared for that problem, didn't see it coming. Mm-hmm. And so the question is, do you stand up a whole new agency that only does this, so there's only one regulator, or do you look around and say, who can do what, how can we get together, how can we solve this problem together? And mostly, or very often, that second one is the way to go. That's what we're doing in water, that's what we're about to do in scams, that's what we're doing here. So the trick is to stay connected, stay talking to each other, mm-hmm. and I think that's probably the solution to the balance point as well.
Yeah.
And I'd just maybe say that, good regulation is good because it gives industry certainty and it gives investors, if you've got a good regulatory environment that's quite stable, you kind of can see into the future and know how you can invest. But bad regulation is bad. So to John's point, I think the fact that other countries have gone ahead and done this, we can learn from that. And some of the people that I've been talking to in the lead up to this conference and said, who's doing it well and who's not. I heard sort of thumbs up for the UK approach and maybe a little bit more concern about how Australia's done it. And I guess the plea for, because we've got a whole lot of stuff happening with AI and, that whole area. And I guess the plea that maybe you have a strong privacy approach, so your privacy legislation is quite robust, and you don't try to solve privacy issues in all of these different verticals that we're going to have to tackle.
Great, thank you. So it sounds like regulation is going to be part of the solution, We need to strike the right balance, and the best way to support industry is by having clarity of where we're going and
These kinds of conversations.
these kinds of conversations. That's right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.